So our final speaker in this half of the panel is Lynn Sloman from Transport for Quality of Life. Lynn.
Lovely, thank you. I'll have the clicker. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about alternatives to cars for surface transport and really focusing on three questions. First of all, how could we make buses and trams and trains much more attractive? Second, could particularly more cycling lead to less car use? And third, how does the planning system affect how we travel? So let's start with that first question. How can we make buses, trams and trains much more attractive? And I want to show you some real-world examples from Munich and Zurich and Dunkirk. So in Munich, city region, so that's the city and the region that surrounds it of smaller towns and rural areas, buses and trains and trams are all coordinated by a public transport governing body, which is called in German a Verkehrsverbund. And that public transport governing body makes sure that all of those services are related to each other and connect with each other. And the motto, which you can see on the side of the wiggly bus there, but translated into English at the bottom, is one network, one timetable, one ticket. And so the whole system is very well coordinated. In Zurich city region, they also have this public transport governing body, or Verkehrsverbund, that coordinates everything between buses and trams and trains. But on top of that, they have public transport service frequency standards, which are enshrined in law. And I'll show you what those standards look like in just a moment. But just to sort of place us, they're Switzerland, and the orange area is the Zurich city region, the city and its surrounding region. And you can see the next biggest town after Zurich is Winterthur, and there's a place called Berg am Echel right up at the top there, which we're going to look at in a moment, which is a tiny little village to show the effect of these public transport standards. So this is what the public transport service standards in Zurich's city region look like. If you live in a settlement with at least 300 people, you will have a public transport service every hour. If you live on a corridor where multiple settlements combine to give strong demand, you will have a service every 30 minutes. If you live in a large, dense settlement, you will have a public transport service at least every 15 minutes. And services run from 6 in the morning till midnight, 7 days a week. Buses and trains connect, and the services repeat hourly at regular intervals. And so let's look at what that means for that little village of Berg am Echel, which has a population of 564 people. The first direct bus to Winterthur from Berg am Echel leaves at 5:30 in the morning. And then from about 10 to 6 in the morning till about 10 to 10 at night, there are 2 buses every hour from this little village to either to Hettlingen or to Andelvingen. And both of those are places on the train line into Winterthur. And when you get to Hettlingen or Andelvingen, you hop off the bus, and there's roughly a 3-minute connection. You walk across the platform, get on your train, and go into Winterthur. And that whole journey takes about 30 minutes. And then the last bus to Winterthur at night is shortly before midnight, 20 to 12. And that happens not just Monday to Friday, but 7 days a week. So this is Sundays as well. So the whole ethos is of a completely comprehensive service. So this is, okay, this is a graph that has got messed up. So let me just explain, and don't worry, I don't know whether the versions you've got in your handouts at work, do they look right, or have they got messed up? Dear me, okay. So ignore the graph, and let me just tell you what I would have told you, which is that if you live in Zurich city region, the average person there makes 500 public transport, about 450 public transport trips per year. If you live in Munich, it's on average about 250 public transport trips per year. If you live in anywhere in a big, in a conurbation, in England, apart from London, then on average you will make about 100 public transport trips per year. So we make very much less public transport, very many fewer public transport trips than people who live in Zurich city region or Munich city region. And the question then is, how much difference does it make that those cities have much higher levels of public transport use? What's the effect of that on car use? And if our English cities and the regions around them had comparable levels of public transport use to the places like Zurich and Munich, we could expect to reduce car mileage by about 9%. And just before I leave talking about public transport, Dunkirk in France has been looking at a new approach to encouraging people to try alternatives to cars. And that is that since September of 2018, they've made all of their bus services free. And at the same time, they also improved the bus network. And the effect of that has been, roughly speaking, almost to double levels of bus use. So bus use has gone up by about 85%. And one in 10 of the new bus users have given up their second car, and about half of the new bus users previously drove. And so that's a sort of new way of getting people to think about not using a car that is starting to develop and becoming there's a lot of interest in it in France at the moment. Let's move on to talking about cycling particularly, and again some real world examples. So first of all, Seville, fourth largest city in Spain. It's got some very big, wide roads, but in the 1990s it had a really big problem with traffic congestion because of a booming economy. And there was a lot of debate about what to do about traffic congestion. Cycling wasn't seen as the natural solution because Seville is a very hot city down in the south of Spain. It didn't have a cycling culture. People said it's too hot to cycle. But despite that, the city administration built 120 kilometres of cycle paths alongside main roads, but segregated from the traffic over a 4-year period. And the effect of that was to increase the number of cycle trips per day quite dramatically, from about 13,000 per day before the cycle network was built to 73,000 afterwards. And you can see on the left-hand side what those cycle networks look like and how they're physically separated from the traffic. And one of the very striking things when you go to Seville is that you see it's not just like young men in lycra cycling. It's older people, young people, women, people who maybe aren't very physically active and fit looking. So ordinary people cycle in Seville. London is building a lot of very high quality cycleways. And those are having a very big effect on the levels of cycling in London. So London is probably the leading city in the UK at the moment in terms of just building lots of cycleways and seeing what effect it has. And it's proving very effective. And some research that Transport for London has done suggests that a very high proportion of the journeys that people make by car are potentially cyclable. Probably about a quarter of the distance driven could potentially be made on a bike. So there's lots to aim at. And cycling can also replace cars outside cities. So this is what's happened in Denmark, in the area around Copenhagen, where they are building a massive network of cycle superhighways alongside main roads, really long distances. Copenhagen's down there at the bottom right. The longest cycleway there that goes right across the page, that's about 40 kilometres. And what they look like once they get out of the towns is shown on the right-hand side. And on those cycleways, typically about 1 in 4 of the people using them previously drove. The average distance cycled is about 15 kilometres. And I'm just going to just skip over this because of time to say that one of the reasons that the cycleways in Copenhagen and Denmark have been so effective is because a lot of people in Denmark are now starting to use electric bikes. And electric bike sales are really high in Europe. They've really taken off much more than they have in the UK, partly because there have been grants to people to buy electric bikes, which is something that we don't yet do here. So just to finish, how does the planning system affect how we travel? And just to say, there are 4 big factors that affect how much we drive that are important to think about when planning, for example, new housing. So location, your big city or rural, density, if homes are close together, at least 100 homes per hectare is the kind of key measure, then many more people will use public transport and walk and cycle. If there are lots of local facilities, people will walk and cycle to them rather than driving, so will use cars less. And developments that have very good connectivity, really good public transport services nearby, will tend to have lower levels of car use. And just 2 final slides. The first one is showing car-dependent housing in rural areas. So this is an area in Essex, a new housing development, about 5 kilometres from the nearest market town. Not very good public transport, and not very many local facilities. And somewhere like this, typically about 80% of residents will drive to work. And in contrast, if you look at the Climate Innovation District, which is planned for Leeds at the moment, going to be designed around walking and cycling, going to have a high density of development, more than 100 homes per hectare. And people who live in areas like this will typically use their car maybe sort of 2 to 3 times less than somebody who lives in a car-dependent rural area. Just notice, by the way, that although that's high density, it's not high rise and it's very green. And so just to finish, do we have the final slide? No. Yes, thank you. Okay, so 3 alternatives to cars that we've looked at. Coordinated public transport with frequent services is a key thing to look at. Cycle tracks and electric bikes can potentially cut car use, and building homes in cities to higher densities with local facilities and with good public transport are also ways that we can look at reducing cars. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So we're going to pause to give you a chance to write down questions. Again, a maximum of 2 questions each for Lynn, 1 per post-it. Table facilitators, once you've done that, if you want to move straight on to prioritising the questions for the speakers, that would be great.